that the American people, the American leaders, were united in their determination to prevent what Eisenhower called in 1954, and what he spoke to Kennedy and me and others about the day before Kennedy was inaugurated, January 19, 1961, the fall of dominoes. And by fall of dominoes, Eisenhower meant that if the West lost South Vietnam to control by the communists, the North Vietnamese, the security of the West would be in danger.
But you, by 1965, you didn't believe that was true, did you? You didn't believe that the Vietnam War would prevent that, did you?
The answer is I did. Well, those are two different points. Now, this is very important. Let me go through this carefully. There were two different points. The first point is that Eisenhower in 54 and again in 61, and we all in the Kennedy and Johnson administration believed, as I think you believed, you British believed, that the loss of South Vietnam to the Chinese and Russian communists would endanger the security of the West. It would lead to what Eisenhower called falling dominoes, the loss of Malaysia, the loss of Indonesia, the loss of Thailand, and possibly even the loss of India, and that this would endanger the security of the West. And we still believe that in 1965.
But you didn't believe the war would prevent
this
that
is a
happening.
Different issue now.
Why didn't you resign?
Wait a minute.
When you didn't believe that, why didn't you resign?
Let me take a second to make absolutely clear here. That President Kennedy and I, as Secretary of Defense, and certainly Johnson and Rusk and the National Security Advisors, Bundy and so on, and the Joint Chiefs, had two contradictory policies. Number one, it was absolutely essential we stop the communists from taking control of South Vietnam. Number two, the defense of South Vietnam could only be carried out by the South Vietnamese. Those were the two policies. Now, by 1965, we still believed that if we lost South Vietnam, the dominoes would fall. The communists would have weakened the security of the West. We still believe that.
But Mr. McNamara, your belief,
let me go on to say that by
we need to get to this point.
In December 1965, I told the president I didn't believe there was more than 1 in 3, or at best 1 in 2, chances of winning the war militarily, and therefore we had to put much greater emphasis on the diplomatic track to achieve our objective of avoiding communist control of South Vietnam.
But then why continue to send thousands of people into battle?
That's a very good point. That is the essence.
When you didn't believe it would work.
No. What I believed was, A, we couldn't win militarily, and therefore we should put more emphasis on diplomacy, and the normal approach to diplomacy is to be sure you have a military backing for your diplomacy. So we were going to continue to fight to strengthen our diplomatic initiatives. That was the policy we were following in 65. And the failure was to recognize that given the mindset of the North Vietnamese, there was no way we could win militarily.
But don't you acknowledge your failure in continuing to send all these young men to their deaths, knowing that it wouldn't achieve your objective?
Leave the word failure out. Certainly it was an error. But you've got to understand how it came about. And it came about because...
It's a huge error.
Wait a minute. It came about for two reasons. Number one, most people totally disagree. Most of the leaders of the government in the Congress and in the executive branch, and in the society, by the way, the common belief of the media, the academicians, the Congress, the political leadership, the military leadership of this country in December 1965, when I made this statement to you, I did, was McNamara's wrong. We can win militarily.
Why didn't you resign?
Because I thought...
When they were following policies you didn't agree with.
Because what they were doing, I hope, was moved further toward negotiation. And we did put forward, I put forward, and the presidents put forward, 7 diplomatic initiatives between 1965 and 1968 to try to achieve an end to the military conflict in the war without giving up our objective of avoiding weakening of the West's security.
Do you regret not resigning?
No, I don't regret not resigning, because I was trying to do what I thought would minimize casualties to the country, try to reduce the flow of military personnel, and at the same time avoid weakening the security of the West.
But tens of thousands went.
No, what I really regret is that we didn't thrash out more than we did, whether we could or couldn't win the war militarily. As I mentioned a moment ago, the majority of the military leaders, the majority of the political leaders, the majority of the academicians, the majority of the press believed I was wrong. They all believed we could win militarily. What we should have done was really have a knockdown, drag-out fight as to whether we could or couldn't win militarily. And secondly, we should then have put much more emphasis on diplomatic initiatives than we did, assuming for the minute I could prove to them that we couldn't win militarily. If I could have proved that, then we should have put much more emphasis on diplomatic.
But why not go to the president and say, I don't believe in this policy of sending tens of thousands more people to their deaths in Vietnam because I don't think it's going to achieve the objectives, and I'm going to say goodbye to your administration.
The first point is, there wouldn't be tens of thousands of more people to death. The number of people, U.S. people killed by the end of '65 was small, was a very small number.
But however many.
All right, but nobody was predicting tens of thousands U.S. death then. Why didn't I resign? Because I think citizens have a responsibility to presidents to serve as long as the presidents want them and the citizens feel they can influence policy.
And to keep your doubts to yourself.
No, I didn't keep my doubts to myself. Hell, read my public statements at the time. I was saying to the public, at best, it's going to be a long war. Now, there were times between 1961 and 1968 when I, and certainly others, said we're making progress militarily. But the majority of my statements were, I think it's fair to say, troubling, pessimistic, because that was the nature of the conflict.
Does it still trouble you, Vietnam?
Of course it does. That's why I'm spending a lot of my time today trying to understand better than I have how this came about. And these recent meetings with the North Vietnamese, what I call the North Vietnamese, the leaders in Hanoi, who were the leaders in North Vietnam at the time, are exposing information we didn't understand before. They didn't understand, by the way. And what is clear now is we both misunderstood each other. We both, and by the way, that is a common cause of conflict. We almost went to nuclear war over the introduction of the nuclear missiles into Cuba by the Soviets in October 1962 for exactly the same reason. Khrushchev misunderstood us, and we certainly didn't understand him.
During the Cuban Missile Crisis,
yes.
Let's talk more in detail
yes.
about that. Did you know what you were doing? I don't mean that.
Well, that's a good,
I don't mean that with disrespect, but here were a bunch of people sitting there in the executive office deciding the fate of the world. Did you know what you were doing?
Let me make 2 points that may seem contradictory to you. The first point is that I think, with hindsight, it was the best managed foreign policy crisis of the past 50 years. And if you've read the Kennedy tapes and have read the other literature, including the reports of the 5 meetings that we had with Cuban and Soviet and American leaders over a period of 5 years, 1987 to 1992, I think you would agree it's the best managed foreign policy crisis. We came that close to nuclear war. We lucked out. We lucked out. Because
why? In what way?
We lucked out in the sense that, I'll just give you one illustration of it. On Saturday night, October 27th, this was the height of the crisis. It was October 28th, the next day, Sunday, that Khrushchev announced publicly he would take the missiles out. On Saturday night, the majority of Kennedy's military and civilian advisors would have recommended to Kennedy, had the missiles not come out, would have recommended early the next week that we engage in the contingency plans, that we apply the contingency plans we'd already set up. The first day's airstrike was 1,080 sorties. We had 180,000 troops and ships ready to carry out an amphibious invasion. They would have advised on Monday to initiate that.
You're going to launch 1,080 sorties.
1,080 sorties. That was the first day's airstrike.
So we were within a hair's trigger of that.
And we were within a hair's trigger of that. What we didn't know was what we would confront. At that time, we had photographs of the launchers to launch warheads, Soviet warheads, against the East Coast, targeted on the East Coast. We didn't learn until 30 years later that the Soviet Union had 162 nuclear warheads on the soil of Cuba. And that's what we would have confronted.
Can you
we
give
carried
me
that out. And 90 of those 162 were tactical warheads that would have been used against our invasion force. We came that close. Now,
Robert McNamara, give me an idea, as those deliberations were taking place in the Oval
Yeah.
Office, give me an idea of the atmosphere. Was there panic? Were you close
no,
to panic at any time?
No, it wasn't panic. Well, number one, we didn't know there were nuclear warheads there.
Take me to the atmosphere in those meetings.
On that Saturday night that I spoke of, Saturday night, October 27th. I'll tell you in a moment what I did that night. But prior to that time, I hadn't been home for 12 days. I slept in the Pentagon. That was the atmosphere. I was going to be available and on top of the situation 24 hours a day. And I was. We were.
How nervous were you?
Well, how nervous was it? As I left the president's office on Saturday night, October 27, 1962, it was a gorgeous night. It was a beautiful fall night. And Washington in the fall is absolutely lovely. I walked out of the Oval Office to go to my car in the White House grounds and drive back to the Pentagon. And as I walked down, I thought I might never see another Saturday night. Now that's the way it was. Not that I thought that there were nuclear warheads in Cuba. I didn't. But what I did know or believe, a belief, by the way, that wasn't shared by many of my associates, what I believed was that if we launched the attack, which we were ready to launch, and which Kennedy and I would have tried to defer, I know, but which ultimately might have come back. If we had launched that attack, I believed that the Soviets would respond militarily somewhere in the world.
Robert McNamara, the perception has been for many years that somehow the US and the West won the Cuban Missile Crisis. But it's transpired since then that Kennedy was doing backdoor deals in order to take the Jupiter missiles out of Turkey and give Russia a face-saving solution.
That is incorrect.
So it wasn't eyeball to eyeball. He was doing deals
let me tell you,
through the back door.
Let me tell you, it was eyeball to eyeball, and there was no deal. I was in the room when all this went on, and you're talking about the alleged deal that we would take Jupiter missiles out of Turkey in return for Khrushchev taking them.
It's not alleged. You did. You did take the missiles out.
It was not a deal. That's the important point. It was not a deal. Number one, the Jupiters were junk. And this was very clear. Number two, we had planned to take them out. Number three, there was a tremendous resistance to taking them out from the Turks and from NATO under these circumstances, because the Turks and NATO said, look, you're knuckling under the Soviets if you take those missiles out of there in return for taking them out. Therefore, we, the Turks, or we, NATO, are absolutely opposed to it. We will not be able to rely on your guarantee of our security if that's the way you behave. You knuckle under the Soviets. So there was no deal. But what Kennedy did, and it was a very smart move, he said to Bobby, you go see Dobrynin, the Soviet ambassador, you tell him, we're going to take those missiles out of Turkey. They're junk. We're going to take them out. But if Khrushchev ever says that it was part of a deal, or ever discloses that we told him that, we'll put him back in. And that was the way it was. And by the way, Khrushchev lost his job as a result of all this. It was not a deal.
What in your background equipped you to manage some of the key crises of this century? We talked about Vietnam, we talked about the Cuban Missile Crisis. What equipped you? You'd served with distinction in the U.S. Army Air Force. You'd been an industrialist. You'd risen to the top of the Ford Motor Company. But why you in that position?
Well, I guess some people might say it was the wrong choice. But we have made some progress. I hope I've contributed to it. We have, I think, exposed certain lessons that the human race will benefit from if we can learn them. Why me? Well, I had an odd background, perhaps. As you know, the Irish, after the potato famine, moved out. A lot of them moved out of Ireland, came over here. My family, my uncles and aunts, and all on my father's side, my grandfather came with the Irish. 1860s or so on. And my father had never gone beyond the 8th grade. My mother had never gone beyond high school, and they were determined that this son of theirs was going to have opportunities.
So you were pushed?
I was pushed. That's exactly the point to start with. The second point to make is that my father was Catholic, my mother was Protestant, and today I don't believe in any literal translation of the Bible, but I am I'll call it a Christian. I am, well, that's perhaps the wrong word. I am a believer in the foundation of most of the world's religions. Most of the world's religions share a common moral foundation, whether it's the Jewish faith or the Catholic or the Protestant faith or the Hindu faith or the Muslim faith. And I grew up with that religious atmosphere and religious background. And I share it, and I believe in it today.
You grew up ambitious as well,
because
you were one of those whiz kids that went from the Air Force to the Ford Motor Company.
I grew up ambitious because my family, as most American families did, went through the Depression. I grew up in the Depression. There were 25% of the adult males in the U.S. unemployed. When I went into the University of California in Berkeley in 1933, parents of my classmates were committing suicide because they couldn't take care of their families. Now and I grew up in a magnificently liberal institution, the University of California, one of the greatest universities in the world at that time. I couldn't have gone to college had this not been a state university. It cost me $52 per year to go to college. I lived at home, that's all I had to pay.
When you went forward,
I was determined to try to move ahead, to use whatever capabilities I had in the interest of, I'll call it myself and my family, but also in the interest of society.
How important was family to you?
Very, very important. For example, when President Kennedy, or President-elect Kennedy, asked me to serve as Secretary of Defense, I said, "You're crazy as hell. I'm not qualified. I'm president of Ford Motor Company. That didn't qualify me to be Secretary of Defense." Well, he said, "Who do you think is?" Well, that's a pretty tough question. In your government, you know, Dennis Healy had been a shadow minister, and he had been trained to be defense minister. In Germany, Helmut Schmidt was shadow defense minister when I was secretary. There isn't any shadow minister in the U.S. That's why you get a Ford Motor Company president, secretary of defense. It's a serious, in a sense, serious deficiency of our system. It brings in some qualities, but it doesn't bring in experience.
People have said, Lee Iacocca, I think, said at the time that you were pretty cold and unemotional. Were you pretty cold and unemotional character?
I think one of my greatest weaknesses is being too emotional at times. I'll try not to be on this program.
About what? What makes you emotional? What upsets you?
What upsets me is when we human beings don't realize the best in ourselves, I guess. Put very simply, that's it. And when we perhaps don't credit others with the same values that we have. I've had a fantastic experience. I've been meeting with the Vietnamese, trying to understand, I'll call it the North Vietnamese leaders. I've been meeting with them in Hanoi, trying to understand how in God's name they behave so irrationally, or what I consider irrationally.
They think the same about you.
And they think the same of us. And it almost brings you to tears. They became quite emotional. We became quite emotional because we finally understood we both misunderstood each other.
So what's the lesson from this then?
Well, the lesson is that there are several different lessons, but the number one lesson is, for God's sakes, understand your opponent.
Which you didn't.
Which we didn't, and which they didn't, and which you and we aren't. That's the important. I don't think we understand, certainly I speak for America today, I don't think we understand the Muslims, the Muslim fundamentalists. I don't think we in America understand the Chinese. I doubt that you do. I'm not sure we understand the Russians. And I think it's very, very important that we, I'm speaking now of we great powers, Britain, U.S., and others, and we who have leadership positions in society, for God's sakes, try to understand other people. And we in America do not. I'll give you an illustration of that. We are the most powerful nation in the world. We're going to remain the most powerful nation in the world for decades ahead. At times, we think, or we act at least as though we think we're omniscient. We act unilaterally. Just look at our policy toward Cuba. It's insane. Nobody else will go with us. We think we know more than anybody else in the world. We're going to apply our power unilaterally. We're going to apply sanctions to Cuba, and by God, we'll force Castro.
So America should stay out of other people's affairs?
No, I won't say that.
Isn't that the lesson?
No, the lesson is America should not act unilaterally to impose its will on other peoples.
People have said that Robert McNamara is a tragically conflicted man over what took place. Are they right?
Well, I don't think so. I don't think I'm either tragic or conflicted.
No doubts, no uncertainties.
Oh my God, I got all kinds of doubts about the human race and about American policy and about myself, sure. But I'm not conflicted. I know what I want to do, what I'm trying to do. For example, I'm trying to move our country, and I think it has to start here, to eliminate nuclear weapons.
But I meant about the past, about what happened.
Oh, heck, the past is the past. I'm looking to the future.
Do you wish you could do it all again?
Yeah, I'd do some things differently, I hope. But the answer is yes.
Robert McNamara, thank you very much for being with us on the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To South Vietnam could only be carried out by the South Vietnamese. Those were the two policies. Now, by 1965, we still believed that if we lost South Vietnam, the dominoes would fall. The communists would have weakened the security of the West. We still believe that.
But Mr. McNamara, your belief.
No, but let me say let me go on to say that by
we need to get to this point.
In December 1965, I told the president I didn't believe there was more than 1 in 3, or at best 1 in 2, chances of winning the war militarily, and therefore we had to put much greater emphasis on the diplomatic track to achieve our objective of avoiding communist control of South Vietnam.
But then why continue to send thousands of people into battle?
Look, that's a very good point. That is the essence.
When you didn't believe it would work.
No. What I believed was, A, we couldn't win militarily, and therefore we should put more emphasis on diplomacy, and the normal approach to diplomacy is to be sure you have a military backing for your diplomacy. So we were going to continue to fight to strengthen our diplomatic initiatives. That was the policy we were following in '65. And the failure was to recognize that given the mindset of the North Vietnamese, there was no way we could win militarily.
But don't you acknowledge a failure in continuing to send all these young men to their deaths, knowing that it wouldn't achieve your objective?
Leave the word failure out. Certainly it was an error. But you've got to understand how it came about. And it came about because...
It was a huge error.
Wait a minute. It came about for 2 reasons. Number one, most people totally disagree. Most of the leaders of the government in the Congress and in the executive branch, and in the society, by the way, the common belief of the media, the academicians, the Congress, the political leadership.
Disrespect, but here were a bunch of people sitting there in the executive office deciding the fate of the world. Did you know what you were doing?
Let me make 2 points that may seem contradictory to you. The first point is that I think, with hindsight, it was the best managed foreign policy crisis of the past 50 years. And if you've read the Kennedy tapes and have read the other literature, including the reports of the 5 meetings that we had with Cuban and Soviet and American leaders over a period of 5 years, 1987 to 1992, I think you would agree it's the best managed foreign policy crisis. We came that close to nuclear war. We lucked out. Because
why? In what way?
We lucked out in the sense that, I'll just give you one illustration of it. On Saturday night, October 27th, this was the height of the crisis. It was October 28th, the next day, Sunday, that Khrushchev announced publicly he would take the missiles out. On Saturday night, the majority of Kennedy's military and civilian advisors would have recommended to Kennedy, had the missiles not come out, would have recommended early the next week that we engage in the contingency plans, that we apply the contingency plans we'd already set up. The first day's airstrike was 1,080 sorties. We had 180,000 troops and ships ready to carry out an amphibious invasion, they would have advised on Monday to initiate that.
You're going to launch 1,080 sorties.
1,080 sorties. That was the first day's airstrike.
So we were within a hair's trigger of that.
And we were within a hair's trigger of that. What we didn't know was what we would confront. At that time, we had photographs of the launchers to launch warheads, the Soviet war, military leadership of this country in December 1965, when I made this statement to you, I did, was McNamara's wrong. We can win militarily.
Why didn't you resign?
Because I thought...
When they were following policies you didn't agree with.
Because well, what they were doing, I hope, was moved further toward negotiation. And we did put forward, I put forward, and the president's put forward, 7 diplomatic initiatives between 1965 and 1968 to try to achieve an end to the military conflict in the war without giving up our objective of avoiding weakening of the West's security.
Do you regret not resigning?
No, I don't regret not resigning because I was trying to do what I thought would minimize casualties to the country, trying to reduce the flow of military personnel and at the same time avoid weakening the security of the West.
But tens of thousands went.
No, what I really regret is that we didn't thrash out more than we did, whether we could or couldn't win the war militarily. As I mentioned a moment ago, the majority of the military leaders, the majority of the political leaders, the majority of the academicians, the majority of the press believed I was wrong. They all believed we could win militarily. What we should have done was really have a knockdown, drag-out fight as to whether we could or couldn't win militarily. And secondly, we should then have put much more emphasis on diplomatic initiatives than we did, assuming for the minute I could prove to them that we couldn't win militarily. If I could have proved that, then we should have put much more emphasis on diplomatic.
But why not go to the president and say, I don't believe in this policy of sending tens of thousands more people to their deaths in Vietnam because I don't think it's going to achieve the objectives, and I'm going to say goodbye to your administration.
The first point is there wouldn't be tens of thousands of more people to the death. That the American people, the American leaders, were united in their determination to prevent what Eisenhower called in 1954, and what he spoke to Kennedy and me and others about the day before Kennedy was inaugurated, January 19, 1961, the fall of dominoes. And by fall of dominoes, Eisenhower meant that if the West lost South Vietnam to control by the communists, the North Vietnamese, the security of the West would be in danger.
But you, by 1965, you didn't believe that was true, did you? You didn't believe that the Vietnam War would prevent that, did you?
The answer is I did. Well, those are 2 different points. Now, this is very important. Let me go through this carefully. There were 2 different points. The first point is that Eisenhower in 54 and again in 61, and we all in the Kennedy and Johnson administration believed, as I think you believed, you British believed, that the loss of South Vietnam to the Chinese and Russian communists would endanger the security of the West. It would lead to what Eisenhower called falling dominoes, the loss of Malaysia, the loss of Indonesia, the loss of Thailand, and possibly even the loss of India, and that this would endanger the security of the West. And we still believe that in 1965.
But you didn't believe the war would prevent that
This is a different issue now.
Why didn't you resign? Wait a minute. When you didn't believe that, why didn't you resign?
Let me take a second to make absolutely clear here. President Kennedy and I, as Secretary of Defense, and certainly Johnson and Rusk and the National Security Advisors, Bundy and so on, and the Joint Chiefs, had 2 contradictory policies. Number one, it was absolutely essential we stop the communists from taking control of South Vietnam. Number 2, the number of people, U.S. people killed by the end of 65 was small, was a very small number.
But however many.
All right, but nobody was predicting tens of thousands U.S. death then. Why didn't I resign? Because I think citizens have a responsibility to presidents to serve as long as the presidents want them and the citizens feel they can influence policy.
And to keep your doubts to yourself.
No, I didn't keep my doubts to myself. Hell, read my public statements at the time. I was saying to the public, at best it's going to be a long war. Now, there were times between 1961 and 1968, when I, and certainly others, said we're making progress militarily. But the majority of my statements were, I think it's fair to say, troubling, pessimistic, because that was the nature of the conflict.
Does it still trouble you, Vietnam?
Of course it does. That's why I'm spending a lot of my time today trying to understand better than I have how this came about. And these recent meetings with the North Vietnamese, what I call the North Vietnamese, the leaders in Hanoi, who were the leaders in North Vietnam at the time, are exposing information we didn't understand before. They didn't understand, by the way. And what is clear now is we both misunderstood each other. We both, and by the way, that is a common cause of conflict. We almost went to nuclear war over the introduction of the nuclear missiles into Cuba by the Soviets in October 1962 for exactly the same reason. Khrushchev misunderstood us, and we certainly didn't understand him.
During the Cuban Missile Crisis,
Yes.
let's talk more in detail
Yes.
about that. Did you know what you were doing? I don't mean that.
Well, that's a good.
I don't mean that with